on for today is I think there were a lot of questions across our social media panel platforms regarding vaccination, some questions regarding efficacy, some questions regarding side effects and immunology. So I think we wanted to try to address some of those questions here tonight between colleagues and friends. The intent is to improve and enhance all of our knowledge. And that's kind of the intention behind this program, which Dr. Tajammul Hussain and Dr. Ismail Shakib have put together with our panelists. I'm going to introduce our panelist here in just a minute. I was just waiting for a couple more people to get on here. And alhamdulillah, we have a decent sized audience. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First and foremost, before I give it over to our president, Dr. Tajammul Hussain, I want to introduce our panelists for today. Sheikh Amin Kolwadia will be joining us a little bit later, but he is going to be on the presentation today. He is an Islamic scholar, obviously well known, alhamdulillah, founder of Darul Qasim, and keen interest in bioethics. He helps support many physicians who are involved in bioethics. On our panel today, in addition, we have obviously the Dr. Tajammul Hussain and Dr. Ismail Shakib, the founder and co-founder of CMMA, who have put together this program. We have Dr. Javed Ansari. He's an associate professor of medicine at Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University. He is a transplant nephrologist with keen interest in immunology. We have Professor Dr. Nadeem Fazal. He's an MD, PhD in immunology and microbiology at Chicago State University, also affiliated with Loyola University. We have Dr. Imad Umar, infectious disease consultant. He is from Tennessee. He is an assistant professor of medical education in the College of Medicine, University of Tennessee Health Sciences Center. We have Dr. Seema Ahmed, who is also an infectious disease consultant and who has helped CMMA and CMMA members throughout this pandemic from the get-go, from members actually getting COVID, personally helping them as an infectious disease consultant. She's with Amida Health System in the Northwest suburbs. I, again, will be moderating today's discussion. So without further ado, I would like to ask Dr. Tajammul Hussain, if everyone can be on mute, inshallah ta'ala, and I'll ask Dr. Tajammul Hussain to kind of give us a brief intro, and then we will get started.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Can you hear me, everybody? Can you hear?
We can hear you, Dr. Hussain.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Dr. Imad Omar, Dr. Ismail Shakib, Javed Ansari, Dr. Nadeem, and Sheikh Amin for accepting to conduct this panel discussion. We are very glad, and some of the names are very known. Probably people don't know much about Dr. Nadeem. He's internationally known immunologist. He's very humble. He stayed low profile, but he has many publications in immunology and very well-known scholar, internationally known. So I'm glad that he accepted my request. And in last moment, Dr. Imad Omar also accepted the request. I'm very glad. Thank you very much, Dr. Omar. And Sheikh Amin accepted that. We had a very short notice because we're doing for all the physicians and health-related workers, so that they have a lot of myths and some confusion, so people can get the clarifications regarding this vaccine. So I welcome everyone, and I hope this is going to benefit everyone and clear the doubts and any myths, and then there's lots of conspiracies and all going to get clear. And also, some of our speakers are there very religious. Dr. Nadeem Fazal is a very religious person, so he has knowledge in both sides, Islamic knowledge as well as in immunology. So they are able to clarify many doubts. So inshallah, this is going to be a very enlightening talk, and hope it's going to benefit everybody and to get rid of this devastating pandemic. And one more thing, I'm going to I'm glad that Ismail also took the vaccine. I'm going to see his hair going to get short very soon, like mine too. So, okay, thank you everybody for joining this one. And inshallah, we'll start. I'm giving the mic to Bashir Qazi. He's the moderator and he's a CMMA board member. And inshallah, he will take over from now.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We're going to get started. Dr. Javed Ansari, he has his slides on. I think it should be visible to everybody. Javed Bhai, please go take over.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. To all my colleagues, friends, brothers and sisters who've joined today. First of all, I'd like to give a disclaimer that I'm not an infectious disease person, neither am a vaccinologist, but I do have a very strong interest in immunology as a part of my profession and my research. And I study the immune system very, very closely and deal with it every day, which I would like to share some of the insights from what little I know. And the next disclaimer, and an important one, is that I'm absolutely not qualified to give any recommendations or any statements about the Islamic perspective of this. So I would leave that to the shuyukh that you would like to take that information from. So with that, I'd like to start. And as you can see, I'm going to briefly cover the immunological aspects of vaccination with some focus on whatever is known about the COVID mRNA vaccine so far. And with that, inshallah, we'll start. Bismillah. But before we do that, I think it will help to go over briefly an overview of immune response to pathogens. And that is because it helps to understand how the immunologist would like to separate the immune responses for purposes of explanation. So there are two main arms of immune responses, the innate immunity and the adaptive immunity, as depicted in this cartoon here. And can anyone see my pointer, or do I?
We can see it.
Okay, good. So just a generic pathogen, let's take a respiratory pathogen. When it enters the upper respiratory tract, as depicted here, it binds the epithelial receptors on the epithelial surface of the mucosa and then enters the cell. As soon as it does that, there are several events that take place, which are all lumped into the innate immune responses. There's a whole host of paracrine and cytokine mediators are released, including, some of them are listed here, including histamine, other cytokines, which are released and recruit cells of the innate immune system that are already circulating within the blood, but more are recruited based on these signals. The more prominent ones that are listed here are the mast cells and the basophils, the natural killer cells. Complement system always is ready to go. It's a primed system, and it's like a ticking clock, which is continuously running and can ramp up at very short notice. And then, of course, there are other mononuclear and polymorphonuclear cells that can be recruited very quickly to mediate this immediate response that happens. And these are critical because these are the ones that are going to summon the cells of the adaptive immunity depicted here. And they basically reside in the lymphoid organs, either that are close to the peripheral organs, like here in this case, the adenoid or the tonsils, or it could be the lymph nodes and the spleen and such. So this is how the immune system is classified by immunologists. And when a pathogen enters the host, these events take place, and then they summon the immune responses. The whole idea for this immune response to take place is to have a concerted effort which will end up in a cognate immune response that is very specific to that pathogen, and that involves a number of immune cells such as T lymphocytes, antigen-presenting cells, B lymphocytes, and their effector molecules, which are cytokines, cytolytic molecules, and antibodies. So with that background, let's look at what happens when a vaccine is administered. So this very response takes place, and it's critical first step, and the outcome of the vaccine really depends on this, and you will understand why in a minute. So when the vaccine is administered, particularly in this case, either subcutaneously or intramuscularly, the injury mediated by the needle itself serves this purpose, because that injury triggers this immediate danger response that starts to summon these innate immune responses. And then the vaccine by the vaccine developers is prepared in such a way that it has adjuvants, because the whole idea of vaccine is to provide the antigen for the body to mount an immune response. But if the antigen is provided in a non-inflammatory context, then it may not mount, and very likely will not mount a response that would clear the antigen. It would probably be steered towards tolerating the antigen. And there are actually ways to do this. In fact, there are tolerance studies, in fact, tolerance strategies. You might know that peanut allergy is now being treated by giving peanut in small quantities. And the idea is to provide it in so the context in which the antigen present is critical. So the adjuvant is central to it. But what the adjuvant does is actually incites a very vigorous local immune response. And that involves all these things that were discussed in the last slide. I put that piece of portion of the picture here just for refreshing the memory. And so all of this is going to give rise to local inflammation, which is going to recruit a lot more innate immune cells. There's going to be a lot of edema, swelling, and increased blood flow. And that really provides the right context. And not only that, and we will see in the future slides, that inflammation will prime the antigen presenting cells to mount a very aggressive response as opposed to a tolerogenic response. So all of that pain that we get after vaccination is all because of that. It's all intentional. In fact, if someone does not get pain, that the response is going to be a weaker response. There have not been any great studies to demonstrate that the response, the vaccine response is correlated with the amount of local reaction people get. But one can imagine based on this pathophysiology that that's the case. But what has been shown in studies, that is, if someone takes an immunosuppressant or even non-steroidals at the time of vaccination, then that response is muted. So I would suggest that maybe we should say Alhamdulillah and deal with the local reaction, but shouldn't be despondent if we don't get too much of a local reaction, because there's still going to be a decent response, because this whole phenomenon of injecting the needle going into the arm plus the adjuvant will still incite an immune response. So that's what happens in the local immune response. The antigens then picked up by the antigen presenting cells, primarily dendritic cells, which then actually migrate to the local lymph node. And that's where the two reactions happen. One is the extrafollicular reaction, where these B cells that see the antigen presented by the antigen presenting cells immediately start to proliferate and then start producing antibodies. Initially IgM followed by IgG, but in the short order it is IgM, and then later it is IgG and then IgA that are secreted. These are low affinity antibodies. They circulate in the blood, try to neutralize the antigen, whether it is a bacteria or a virus, and then eventually those antibodies dissipate. But then the T cells that are also present in the extrafollicular space will instruct some of the B cells to go into germinal centers. And those will start to, with the help of follicular DCs, will start to proliferate extensively and then start to manufacture or lead into plasma cells that produce high affinity immunoglobulin G subtypes. And when those are secreted, then there's a higher level of antibody with much higher level of affinity. And those also help in clearing the virus or the pathogen. And then eventually these plasma cells, some of them enter the bone marrow niches and stay there for a long period of time. So next, what happens is that with this primary immune response, the antibody titers rise perhaps about 10 to 14 days. They peak about 4 weeks, as you can see here in this slide. And then eventually the antibody levels dissipate. We don't have time to go into the reasons as to why that might be, but then what the purpose of the booster is to increase or strengthen the immune responses by recruiting more B cells that can become memory and then generate more plasma cells. There's also affinity maturation and increased affinity of the antibodies that are produced on repeated exposure to the antigen. Next, we can look at how the memory B cells are generated. So some of the B cells that were actually present within the follicular, within the germinal centers, they actually, instead of converting into plasma cells or moving on to differentiation as plasma cells, they actually become memory cells. And these are long-lasting memory cells. They reside in the bone marrow and some in the lymph nodes. And they are also very hardy cells, and they live for a very, very long time. And they're only few in number, and they can actually, this is how immunologic memory is predominantly preserved, not through antibodies. So the antibody levels can dissipate over time, but it's the memory B cells that actually keep memory. And in fact, our oncology friends will be able to vouch this, that people even with bone marrow ablation, many a times actually preserve immunologic memory that was acquired in childhood through vaccinations and things like that. So on a secondary exposure, these quickly expand, become plasma cells, and start to generate antibodies at short order. So that's how the B cell arm of the immunity, or the humoral arm of the immunity, works. Now, another important arm of immunity, in fact, much more central than the B cell, is the T cell, which really plays an important role in an adaptive immune response. And as you can see there, the antigen presenting cell, which is the dendritic cell, when it sees the antigen, ingests it, processes it, and presents it, both in the context of MSC class 1 and class 2, to CD4 and CD8 cells. And these individual cells can then expand rapidly to produce cytokines that can then further potentiate the effects of the CD8 T cells, which can function as cytotoxic T cells that directly lyse the target cells or infected tissue and kill the cell and along with the pathogen. The CD8 T cells also produce cytokines such as TNF and interferon gamma that can actually help in clearance of the pathogen. Now, these also can become long-lasting memory T cells, both CD4s and CD8s, that reside in the bone marrow niches and the lymphoid tissue, that can be really long-lasting and provide lasting immunity. So what happens when a person who's vaccinated or who's immunized, either through natural immunity, is exposed to the pathogen the second time? So there's this notion, is the question that whether an immune person can get infected. The answer is yes, the person has to get infected. We have to make a distinction between infection and disease. The infection is needed for the immune response to actually know that there is an intruder, know that there is a pathogen, because then there's the pathogen is not going to know that one person is immune, the other is not immune, but not infected before infecting. So there has to be an infection in every case. Now, when there is an infection, there is a local reaction which can be very brisk. Sometimes, there is now suggestion that even innate immunity can actually, even though by definition it is supposed to be antigen non-specific, there are some data to suggest that these can be specific as well, and they can respond in a much more rapid fashion if it's re-exposed to an antigen. But regardless, even if you don't accept that possibility, the innate immune responses are quickly recruited. Then they recruit the adaptive immunity, which has been induced by previous infection or immunization. But there is always a brief period of time from few hours to at least a few days, depending on the readiness of the adaptive immunity. There's going to be some proliferation of the pathogen within the target organ. For example, the mucosa or the upper respiratory tract in the case of a respiratory pathogen. They will be shedding. There will be potential for transmission of infection. There will also be possibility of turning up a positive test when this happens. But this duration is often very brief, depending on, again, how recent was the previous exposure. So with that, I think it's time to move to the main questions that people might have with regards to this new vaccine approach. And I took a slide from Moderna, from their website, and what they have done. And this is 2 or 3 years before. Actually, this is an old slide, and they were already working with this idea. And not just Moderna, but many other companies and other research labs whose plan was to actually express the antigen through mRNA. And the reason for that is that there's lots of advantages, which I don't think we have time to get into. But let me just go over the brief mechanism as to how this is
excuse me,
supposed to
sorry,
work.
this is here. I'm just interrupting here. Can we have everyone please mute your phones if you're not talking? So, or Smile like if you can mute everyone.
Yeah,
and then
Dr. Ansari, give me 1 second. I'm going to mute all and then unmute you. Dr. Ansari, you can start talking now.
Okay, so this is a nice slide that gives us an overview as to how the mRNA vaccines are supposed to work. So when the mRNA is injected after being formulated in this fashion, and in our case, it is formulated in a lipid nanoparticle that is injected in the muscle tissue, which then enters into the muscle and the antigen presenting cells. After entry into the cell, it is bound to the ribosomes, and the protein is translated. And the protein that is produced is either secreted or processed through the proteasome pathway and into the MHC processing machinery and presented in the context of both MHC1, which will lead to CD8 T cell responses, or MHC2, which will lead to CD4 T cell responses. So T cell responses are triggered. And the surface expression of the viral antigen, if it is supposed to be or engineered to be expressed on a surface, will also then recruit B cells with B cell receptor, which are basically antibodies on the B cells. They can actually then recognize the antigen and start proliferating, and that's how the immune response gets started with such types of vaccines. Moving on, let me see here. I don't seem to have control over my slides. Let's see here. For some reason. Okay, it's working now. So this cartoon actually depicts the different types of cells that are involved. I won't belabor the point. Basically, I think it's been mentioned before. Essentially, all types of immunologic cells are involved in mRNA vaccines, just like any other vaccine. I think this is an important slide to understand as to what actually stimulates the immune response or the antigen presenting cells. The adjuvant is present, but but these vaccines don't rely that much on the adjuvant because the RNA itself is a pretty potent immune stimulator, especially if it is an unmodified and naked RNA. It really stimulates the cell that comes into contact with it. And the reason being, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us in such a way that whenever a virus enters the body, it releases RNA, and same with bacteria, they release DNA and RNA, and that will stimulate the innate immune response by binding to various receptors, toll-like receptors, both that are on the surface, that are in the endosomes, the cytosolic receptors. They eventually then lead to maturation of dendritic cells by upregulating co-stimulator molecules, MHC class 1 and 2 molecules. So there's a side benefit by using this mRNA vaccine, which serves as an immune stimulant, besides actually serving as the instruction as to what protein needs to make. So it's a dual benefit that comes from it, and all of that inflammation is driven by this as well. In the case of the vaccine that's currently available now, the Pfizer mRNA vaccine, it's as many of you know, it's a modified mRNA such that the spike protein is expressed on the surface of the cell in the pre-fusion conformation, meaning it sticks out and just stays there, and on the surface to be available for antigen present, be recognized by antibodies, recognized by B cells or B cell receptors and other antigens. So that's where we are, and I think I will leave it at that. And Dr. Nadeem Fazul can add and or be available for questions. And I'll leave you with this. Hope you will enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ansari, for a very well thought and kind of a base for our discussion. We're getting into kind of the meat here, and Dr. Nadeem Fazul is a immunologist, so we'll get his opinion and his feedback, and then we'll move on to our ID consultants. Dr. Fazul?
Okay, thank you. I mean, everything has been pretty much said about immunology, but I'll just say a few things that, as some of you were asking, that people are, especially in this profession, they keep on asking that. I'm sorry?
Question
I have, can you hear me?
Keep going, Dr.
Yeah, oh, sorry. So there are some questions that people normally ask. I'm just gonna go for that. We have to keep in mind, I'll just, maybe a couple of minutes will say that immune system is a defense system, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made a system that is there to protect us from any insult, viruses, bacteria, cancer, or whatever. And we used to take, most of immunologists, viruses lightly. And we used to think that, oh, it will complete its cycle and go off, which was true. So not much effort was made in that, except the childhood vaccine that all of us got. And we have to keep in mind the most successful story in the history of medicine is vaccination. All other are management, like polio. So in this current situation, a virus which was pretty benign, all of a sudden becomes dangerous and is spreading through respiratory route. And most of the immunologists think that, as you must have heard, that everybody is going to get infected. So, but the problem is that, as Dr. Ansari said, our immune system is not prepared for that. So if you, may Allah protect, get infected right away, your innate immune system will go for your defense, right? And the chances are most of the people are sick because of overzealous immune response, though we want an adaptive immune system to come and help us, right? So one way of getting immunity, of course, not a good way, is to get infected and then fight the battle, or you win or lose. The safer way is to get vaccinated. So you train your immune system, you're prepared for that, and then you can put up a better fight. And vaccinations which are available, this is a common question people ask me, that the current vaccination approved are not fully approved, number one, because they are under emergency use authorization. So they are to be used in emergency by selected cases by the medical professional. And both of them are safe. If they are messenger RNA, based in a lipid nanoparticle. They are not going to cause you any damage. People ask me, and ask pretty sure you as well, that they will mess up your DNA. They don't mess up your DNA, whether they are themselves DNA vaccine, they don't mess up your RNA. They are pretty much safe in that regard. The second question they usually ask that how long that immunity lasts. The answer is we don't know. Most of the question related to COVID-19 particularly, even the immunologists would not know. We are learning, it's going to take a while. We have to complete the cycle. Too much data is coming. We are trying to digest it, but we cannot come up. We are learning as we are going. But the best analysis is that if you get infected, for example, and you built up antibodies, the chances are that you are going to have a robust immune response for at least 6 to 8 months post-infection. That's pretty much what you used to do for flu vaccine. And Dr. Ansari also addressed this question, even if you are infected, there's no harm for you to be revaccinated. There's no problem with that. And then the second thing is about the issue that people usually ask that about, and typical anti-vaxxers and all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to go in that direction. But the only thing is that right now, I read the Pfizer and Moderna website. Their vaccines, according to their declaration, do not contain any adjuvant or preservative. They just have their genetic material of the virus, which is only for the spike protein, in a lipid nanoparticle. That's it, as of now. And then there are other vaccines which are coming up, like Oxford and other, that we may have a different configuration, but we really have to wait till it comes. And finally, I'll just finish with that, as far as the production is concerned about, I think Dr. Jamal asked me as well, I'm not going to comment on that, but I'll just give you a general idea that viruses need a cell culture to grow. They can grow in living cells. They can infect you and me and grow. But if you want to do any experiment for any vaccine related to viruses, we have to grow them on cell line. And they are grown on human cell line most of the time, or genetically modified cell lines. So there are some cancer cell lines, and some of them may have a different origin that people are doubting. But most of that kind of theories are coming from some, as I say, conspiracy theories. But other than that, I don't think that there's any problem in terms of declaration openly by either Pfizer or Moderna. I'll stop there. And if there are any questions, of course, we can take it anytime that you want.
So I think thank you so much. That was an exceptional explanation. I think we'll hold off for the questions till the end. And I'm going to now, before we get to Sheikh Amin, I want to move into the more clinical route onto our infectious disease specialists that we have, Dr. Imad Omar and Dr. Seema Ahmad. So Dr. Omar, you want to take over?
Sure. I'll just say a few brief words about this, and then I can take questions at the end. I think many people sort of in attendance are physicians, and one of the things that we are all asked about is the vaccine. And I can't walk through the hospital without getting questions from nurses and doctors and other people. And I think it is important for all of us to be able to communicate that well about the vaccine. And so I just thought I would go through maybe 5 very common questions that I get asked almost every day. And invariably, the first question I'm always asked is, are you taking the vaccine? Dr. Omar, are you taking the vaccine? And, that seems like a simple question, but it is actually an important one to be patient about. And people are asking you because they think that if you are taking it, maybe I will take it also. And so I think it is an important question, and we should take people's concerns about this vaccine pretty seriously. I think there's a lot of hesitancy, even amongst doctors and nurses and very knowledgeable people. So the answer to that question is yes, I had my vaccine today, in fact. The other question that I get very commonly is, was the vaccine rushed? People have a lot of reluctance and hesitancy because they think that this vaccine came through much more quickly than vaccines have in the past. And that is actually true. And in many ways, that's amazing, but there are reasons for that. One of the reasons for that is that there was a previous virus very similar to this, which was the SARS outbreak about 18 years ago. And at that time, scientists were worried that it would turn into a pandemic, but it did not. And the spike protein of that virus was very similar to the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And so there was already a movement in trying to make a vaccine. That was shelved because it fortunately did not turn into a pandemic and there was no funding. But when the Chinese released the genetic code of this virus, within days, there was a vaccine candidate based on the spike protein. So that doesn't typically happen. That made it very fast. The other thing is, because of the huge impact of this pandemic, there was a lot of effort, both financially and in terms of manpower, that was marshaled towards doing this. The UK, spent £6 billion in sort of moving this forward, and the United States did similar things. Also, the regulatory agencies were working with companies, and part of that was the Operation Warp Speed to try to make it simpler. So there were a lot of things that contributed to this vaccine coming forward very quickly. One is also that our technology has moved very quickly, right? So your computers have changed a lot since 2003. Vaccine technology has as well, and mRNA technology, which our esteemed colleagues have just discussed, is one of those things. So lessons from that previous episode were helpful. The other thing is the sheer scope of the virus. There were so many patients that it was not difficult to recruit patients into these studies. So vaccine studies are done in phases. There's a phase 1, which basically is for the dose and determining the dose and also safety. And then there's phase 2, which expands the safety considerations. And for this vaccine trial for both Moderna and Pfizer, they combined those two and did them at the same time. Typically, companies hadn't done that in the past because they do one, then they do the next one because they're worried that if it doesn't work out, they don't have the money to move further. So a lot of these things they were able to do in a very compressed time because they had a lot of money. The other thing was that typically trying to recruit 10,000 patients in a study is difficult. But for this one, the Pfizer study had almost 44,000 and the Moderna study had 30,000. So for all these reasons, this was able to be done very fast. That's a long answer. The third question that I get asked, and we've talked about this briefly, is what are the side effects? And we can discuss this more in the question and answer session, but generally speaking, the vaccine appears to be very safe, and the side effects are similar to other vaccines that we have. For instance, the flu vaccine, or if anybody has had the shingles vaccine. And the severity seems to be in between those. The flu vaccine is a little milder. The shingles vaccine, perhaps a little bit more side effects. Those minor side effects, injection pain, a little tiredness, headache, fever, those are very common, and that just means your immune system is reacting to the vaccine, which is a good thing. There are some unusual things that have come up, and they are in social media and things like that, and many people have questions about that. So one of the things was Bell's palsy. So Bell's palsy is a problem that sometimes happens and it occurs after viral illnesses. It can occur sometimes, we don't know why. Certain infections can cause it. And one side of the face can become numb or become weak. There were, in both studies, there were people with Bell's palsy, but it doesn't look like that happens any more often than it does naturally. So those things didn't happen more. In the Pfizer study, there were 4 people that got Bell's palsy in the treatment group, but that happened in one patient at 3 weeks, another one at 9 weeks. And so these happened much later. The other thing that some people were concerned about that got a lot of press was anaphylaxis. So there were people, 2 in the UK and then 1 in the US who, had an anaphylactic reaction, had a serious reaction. These were people that already had allergy problems. They were carrying EpiPens with them. So this is not unexpected for vaccines, and this happens, and so these were not unusual effects. The other thing that people were concerned about is fertility, and the quick answer to that is no, it doesn't affect fertility. We can discuss that at length if people have questions about that. I can go into some detail about it, or others can talk about it more. The other there are two interesting things that are being watched that are minor but a little unusual with vaccines. One is that about 1% of people develop lymph node swelling, lymph nodes in their neck and under their arm. So not a serious side effect, but something that's not typical for some vaccines that we have. And then the Moderna vaccine recently described were 3 patients that had problems with facial swelling. And interestingly, these were all people that had these kind of dermal fillers, in their lip, or these dermal fillers. And so there may be a warning that comes on the vaccine because of that. So that's a brief overview of the side effects, and I get asked that a lot. I think this has been covered, but one other thing that I get asked very commonly is, what's in the vaccine? And so people have lots of things. So number one, there are no microchips in the vaccine. And you would not believe that people seriously think that is true, and it is not. So anyway, there's mRNA in the vaccine. There are lipids that help hold the mRNA and allow that mRNA to enter the cell. The lipids also include something called polyethylene glycol. And so you may hear that. That is something that's very common. It's in a lot of things. It's in things like laxatives and things like that, other medicines. And there are some other simple things like sucrose or sugar, potassium, sodium chloride, things to balance the pH, sodium acetate, things like that. It's a very simple, clean vaccine. And so there's not mercury, there's not and no adjuvants, things like that we discussed. So that's very important. It's a very clean vaccine. And then the fifth thing is people want to know, there's lots of questions about, well, what if I had the illness before? Should I get the vaccine or should I not? And the answer is we're not sure. The Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices has not made a specific recommendation for that. Generally, it is felt that natural immunity is not going to be prolonged, very long lasting. So likely, even if you had it before, you likely should get the vaccine. And there's no contraindication right now, we feel, that if you had it, that you can't get it. The exception to that might be
5 minutes extra de diyan तुमको.
I'm sorry.
Keep going. I think it was a mute error there. Keep going.
So just one last point, that if you've had the monoclonal antibody, if you've had bamlanivimab, then you probably need to wait before you get the vaccine, right? That you were recently ill, you had this monoclonal antibody, you probably should wait. Autoimmune illnesses, people always ask me if I have rheumatoid arthritis or lupus, is it okay for me to get the vaccine? Yes. We worry that some people with autoimmune illnesses might not respond to vaccines. That's different. But in terms of safety, there shouldn't be any safe. It's not a live virus, so no problems. People ask about pregnancy. Moderna submitted their pregnancy data. The way this vaccine works, we don't really think that that's going to be a problem, but always there's a great deal of caution when we're dealing with pregnancy with any medication, any vaccine. And so that always requires a separate sort of evaluation by the FDA, and they have given those. No one. So just to say, there were actually people in the Moderna trial that became pregnant during the course of the trial. 13 patients became pregnant, 6 in the vaccine group, 7 in the placebo group. There were a couple of abortions in the placebo group, none in the vaccine group, no serious side effects. And because of the way the vaccine works, it would not be expected that it would be an issue with lactation either. Those are the just very simple 5 questions that I get asked. So I will stop there, and I'm sure there'll be more questions later.
That was terrific. Those are a couple of questions that I had myself that I've heard, and obviously there's going to be varying opinions as well based on and who you're following and what data that we have. There's some great questions. I'm just going to hold off on the questions. I wanted to ask Dr. Seema Ahmed if she has any words of wisdom, and then I'll move over to Sheikh Amin, and then we'll open it to questions. Dr. Ahmed?
The effectiveness, I think it's 95% effective with 2 doses. With the first dose, they're saying it's about 50%. And with the second dose, it's 95%. That's given 3 weeks after the first dose with the Pfizer vaccine. And
That's a great point, Dr. Ahmed. Actually, I was asked that question on a private chat, is why, I know we were going to wait for Q&A, but you addressed it, is why the 2 doses, and is the reaction to the second dose, is it really going to be more as far as adverse events?
Yes, with the second dose, the reaction would be more severe than the first one. But again, that will be the similar side effects, the fever, headache, body aches. In rare cases, it can be lymphadenopathy. And they say that with the second dose, if somebody has lymphadenopathy, they'll have more pronounced lymphadenopathy with the second dose. And they are recommending that for effectiveness, you have to take the second dose. With the first dose, only it's 50% effective. And the few cases that were positive in the trial, it was after the first dose. And the other question that I was asked, the nurses are asking, can we transmit the disease after the vaccination? So the answer is no. I don't think we can transmit the disease with vaccination.
Great. I mean, you hit a couple important questions, and I was seeing some of those kind of fall through. Jazakallah khair. Before we go into more questions, I just want to get, the thing that brings us all together is our deen in our profession. And those are 2 hallmarks of all of us here. And without talking about our deen, I think this conversation would be incomplete. So I wanted to get some words of wisdom from Sheikh Amin, who's on our call.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine. The nur is flashing on the call, mashallah.
Oh, good. So anyway, I'll come out of hiding, show you myself. I'm not a Shia, mashallah. No. So anyway, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina wa Mawlana Muhammadin wa barik wa sallam. Alhamdulillah. This is a great event that you are hosting, and Allah give you barakah and success in your niyyah, and take you to your, inshallah, desired destination, whatever it is. Inshallah. It's always great to see Muslim professionals coming together and discussing values for the community and helping mankind in general. Inshallah, Allah reward you for that too. Inshallah. So anyway, I'm going to leave the floor open. I don't know what kind of questions people have in their minds, but I'm here for a while, and I'll try and address as many as I can, and we'll take it, I think, step by step, inshallah.
Inshallah. Before we get to questions, I mean, any points that you just, as you know, there is a level of anxiety amongst all of us, I think, to a certain extent. I think some of it's getting relieved by seeing more and more people get this. There's a lot of questions, but from a Islamic bioethics aspect, any words of wisdom you wanted to share before we get to the Q&A?
Yeah. I mean, we can go there if you want. It's a very basic, foundational knowledge of how the body works, and foundational knowledge of how the deen works, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he sends down an illness, he sends a cure with it. And alhamdulillah, through Allah's fadl, it seems that a couple of Muslims have found a cure, which is a great service for Muslims. At the same time, human beings are encouraged, recommended, sometimes mandated, to take preventive care causes first, and then they should seek therapy and remedies for any illnesses, aberrations that they may experience. in their bodies and through their bodies. That is part of life and part of the, the prescription of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He never discouraged people from looking into illnesses, and he found that there are some cures for illnesses and diseases, and he would sometimes prescribe certain herbs and certain plants and certain forms of therapy for cure and all of that. So I think in this, very stressful, as you have just put it, time where the whole world is now suffering in the most traumatic way that we perhaps would not have conceived earlier or even perceived or thought about. But I think the rule of thumb is that you must do everything to fight the disease. You must do everything to prevent yourself from procuring the disease. You must do everything, contracting the disease, I should say. You must do everything to make sure that you are safe and people around you are safe, do no harm, as you guys say, mashallah. But at the same time, we should be not too quick to judge those people who are trying to help humanity at large and promote the idea amongst the Muslim masses that this is inshallah a good thing, and we should be the first ones in line to take the vaccination, inshallah. So I'm sure some of you have already had the vaccination, and Allah keep us and preserve us all. But I think there should be no anxiety or stress about the idea of taking medicine in order to, help us improve our health or to avoid problems, avoid sicknesses, and also in case there is a sickness and illness, we should do everything to counter that, because that is Allah's will, and it's also the Prophet's sunnah that we do this. So, that's as far as that. As far as the psychology and the spiritual component, that is clear that there's a time of sabr, a time of patience, a time of dua, a time of mutual compassion and care, a time of, what you call empathy, a time of sadaqah and generosity, a time of coming together. So all of these values are very much at the forefront, I think, in many Muslim families, and I think throughout the world in many Muslim countries are coming together because of the pandemic, and people are working together to help relieve each other from this very stressful illness and disease, inshallah. So these are a few words that I can offer so that people are at ease about the whole institution of medicine and therapy and healing, that it is a sunnah, and we should do everything to make sure that we avoid it, and we take all measures to avoid it, and we take, more importantly, all measures to spread it, to avoid all measures to spread it. I think that's the best thing we can hope for the community, inshallah. Okay.
Inshallah, Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Amin. So I'm going to ask all our panelists to unmute themselves. A lot of the questions are being answered on the chat as we're moving along, alhamdulillah. And so I'm going to try my best to try to get in this chat box here. And if everyone can mute themselves, if you're not talking, if you're not a panelist, please kindly mute yourself so we can kind of focus here. So please, any of the panelists, go ahead and take the questions. I won't call out. I think some of these were answered, but I'm just going to go ahead and fire.
I think
is there?
I have a. Can I say something?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. One of the questions was asked, and I did answer in the chat box, is that vaccine, if you take vaccine, it doesn't protect you from transmission. You can still be infected and transmit it, because this is a emergency use authorization vaccine. The chances hopefully is going to be protective, but doesn't really mean, and the vaccine people, when they say safety, what they mean is the safety to give the injection, and in whatever phase studies have they done. But we don't know whether this vaccine is going to stop the transmission or stop the disease, because keep in mind that many of the people may not have the disease or may be asymptomatic. So by no means people should think that taking vaccine is a license for them to just remove the mask and go around. No, you can still be infected or still have severe disease or may pass it on, because immunity takes a while, because there are two doses, one for within 21 days or 28 days. Is going to take a couple of months for you to even have protective immunity. And none of these vaccine makers have so far proved for sure that the antibodies they're hoping are being made and they are neutralizing antibodies. So a note of caution for all of us, even after taking vaccine.
Just one comment about that, just to build on that. The Pfizer vaccine was approved first for the emergency. They were specifically asked that, and they were not able to answer that question because the study was not designed to determine whether it prevented a symptomatic infection, right? So it prevented disease.
Dr. Imad, 1 second. I'm going to put everyone on mute and mute you. Now, Dr. Imad, you're unmuted now. Go
Yes,
ahead.
so I was just saying that the Pfizer trial was not able to answer that question, and neither was the Moderna study designed to answer that question. But there was some, they did look at this question. And so the Moderna vaccine was protective in 80% after the first dose. And when they did nasal swabs before the first dose and before the second dose, and it looks like that asymptomatic disease was prevented with the Moderna vaccine. So that's interesting, but I agree totally with Dr. Nadeem Fazl's caution that if you get the vaccine, that doesn't mean that you stop wearing masks, that you stop social distancing, that you're able to go to restaurants and carry on normally. Eventually, inshallah, if enough of us get the vaccine and we do all these things that we're supposed to be doing, this disease will come under control and we'll be able to return to those things. But yeah, those questions were not specifically looked at with the trial.
Okay. Dr. Basir Khazi, I think you're unmuted.
Yeah, there's another question here that's sort of interesting scenario, and it's possible if someone has COVID, they don't know yet, they have the COVID virus, they may be asymptomatic or maybe about to begin symptoms, they don't know about it, and they get vaccinated. What happens in that scenario? Is there any? I mean, I guess you can't help that scenario, but if that hypothetical scenario were to occur. Any thoughts immunologically, what would happen?
I am unmuting Dr. Fazal, and Dr. Fazal, you're unmuted.
Okay, I think the purpose of vaccine is to educate the immune system to find out how to make antibodies against the COVID the spike protein. So if the person is already infected, so his system is pretty much there to be educated. But I think at that time, they need to talk to ID specialists. In my opinion, they should not be taking the vaccine if they have a PCR test which is positive and CT count is less than 20. So they have a high volume of genetic material going on. They are not the candidate for the vaccine because I'm pretty sure these are not over-the-counter vaccines. There is a long list of people who are going to get it, and there are criteria, and they are set by authorities. It's not that simple. But I mean, that's like the immunological understanding, but I cannot speak about the priority list in terms of the ID specialists. I think they are the people who will tell what to do.
I think that was a good response.
I would just add to that one thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Generally, if someone is ill, we would suggest that they not take the vaccine. Similarly, if you've had another vaccine, say you had the flu vaccine this week, You should wait 2 weeks before you take the COVID vaccine if it's being offered to you. So generally, but I think the question was, if you had COVID and you didn't know it, well, obviously you can't control that, and many people would not be tested before they take the vaccine. So generally, I would not expect that there would be some, terrible effect of that, but generally you don't want to be ill with anything when you take a vaccine. We would expect that you'd have a better response if you did it when you were not ill.
I have thank you. That was a great explanation. Sheikh Amin, I do have a direct question to you. And it's regarding, I did read the Dar al-Qasim fatwa that came out recently. There's a question, can we get a clarification on the Dar al-Qasim fatwa on taking the vaccine and the vaccine ingredients?
Well, the Dar al-Qasim fatwa, I think, is self-explanatory. I don't think we said it is haram. We didn't say that don't take it. We didn't discourage it. I think you have to read it and not assume, I think, with a selective perception that we're discouraging. We were talking about that there are no dubious ingredients in these two vaccines, and we said that it's a no-brainer, that they are permissible, and whatever your physician recommends, you should do. That was a very straightforward, I think, statement. The only issue was that if, God forbid, there might be dubious ingredients in any vaccine or the process by which the vaccine is manufactured, then that will be subject to our scrutiny. That's what we said in the fatwa. I don't think we discouraged anybody. So we're on the same page as most people. And God forbid, if there is such a great dire need in the ummah and the community that, God forbid, there is a little bit of a haram ingredient at this time in the pandemic, then the mufti will never say kill yourself. He's not going to say commit suicide because the Quran allows you to take pork if you're dying. Okay, the only condition there in the Quran is that your mindset must not be that you're consuming haram without regarding, without having a mindset of taqwa, that I'm doing this with great reservation. I'm doing this only to save my life. I'm not doing this because I'm seeking pleasure from eating the pork or drinking the wine. So the Quran makes it clear that the mindset should be that you're avoiding sin, and that you're not conceding to sin. So that mindset is very critical, I think, that when Muslims talk about saving lives, and I've mentioned this several times in many talks, and even there's an article out there now on the Dar al-Qasim website, that we cannot be reactionaries all the time. Now, this is a pandemic, and these are dire circumstances, in a very dire situation where the mufti will say that, yes, in this situation, go ahead and, save yourself. But then there again, the proof's in the pudding. I mean, I'm not hearing from the experts here that it's a given. Okay? So when the utility of something is still subject to debate, then obviously we have to step back and wait for a time when the scientific community comes to a reasonable consensus and tells us that, yes, by taking this vaccine, you're going to prevent yourself from, contracting the disease, and people will be prevented and people will be helped if you take the vaccine. Then, then obviously that's a no-brainer. But until that consensus and that threshold is met, okay, we're not going to simply concede and say, okay, that you must take pork because this is the only thing available at the moment. So we're not going to concede to that. My issue is that the Muslim mindset must not become the mindset of a consumer and then jump into taking everything that's haram without even any reservation whatsoever. Okay? That's the mindset the Quran does not allow the Muslim to keep and to maintain. So that's our position. So the position is very clear, that where there is no haram ingredient in any vaccine, that's a no-brainer. Go ahead, Bismillah, take it. Where there might be a haram ingredient, then we will definitely investigate and see what is the level of necessity that we must ascertain. And we can do it within an hour, within half an hour. That's not a problem. But what I'm hearing from this forum time and time again is that you don't have a consensus as to how the efficacy of this vaccine is going to play out. And until we get a reasonable, inshallah, confidence builder, then I think we will take a step back and say, okay, we'll wait for the scientific community to come to the table and tell us, yes, now we are confident, and we can say confidently that this is now going to be all across the board. It's going to help us. You know, so the first dose is 50%, and the second dose is 95%. The 95% is great. That's wonderful. That's all we need. But the 50% might be an issue. And then we do have to be careful, because as we say, first do no harm, the Muslim mindset is first do no sin. That's where the Islamic of the bioethics meet the medical bioethics. That's the Islamic portion of bioethics, where there's no sin. So the Mufti has to ascertain, is there sin in this? If there is, then to what degree do we need to accommodate the sin in order to save lives? That's our position. It's a very principled position. It's not reactionary. It's very technical, and only a person who knows and understands how to go into the nitty-gritty details of the law and the principles of law will be able to understand what it takes to give a fatwa. But as I said, if the medical community says that we're okay with it and we can reasonably say that it's going to save lives, then Bismillah, we're not going to be there stopping people from taking vaccines. That's not our position. So if you read, the key is read the fatwa and not the last line, then I think you'll be okay with the fatwa, inshallah.
Inshallah. Jazakallah khair. We're getting towards an hour and 10 minutes here. I'm going to take 2 or 3 rapid questions, and inshallah we'll conclude with Sheikh Amin Zuwa if he's generous enough, inshallah, to do a dua for all of us today. So I'm going to get to whoever wants to take this from the panel, please go ahead and do so. Or if you're seeing a question that hasn't been answered, please chime in.
I think one of the things that I, just for public interest, keep in mind, because I'm going to talk a little bit of, as Sheikh has said very rightly, one of the things we have to keep in mind that both vaccines are developed by the big pharma companies, right? And they are manufacturing companies. They have not submitted the details of how they make vaccine in detail. They are taking advantage of the emergency use authorization where rules are not that stringent. For example, both of these vaccines are not good even if there is a remote chance for any person less than 16 to 18 years of age. So that's something in the concern. But if they were to apply for full authorization from the FDA, the rules are tough and strict. They still have to have more data. They are working on that data. And as Dr. Imad said, that they benefited from production of this vaccine in such a short time because the influence of the government, they paid them in advance, billions of dollars. That did never happen in the history of vaccine formation. So there are some financial logistics, but I agree with Sheikh Amin that we are, as immunologists, I can tell you that we ourselves do not know how this virus is. We're not going to tell this virus how to behave. We are learning from the virus. Unless and until we go through this whole cycle for the next 6-8 months, all our information are subject to change. That's a scientific fact. And then many things will come. We may be in a better position to let people know to the best of our knowledge within a year or so when things will be more or less settled. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
No, great point, Dr. Fazal. This question is for Dr. Javed Ansari. It's a pretty specific question. One of our members is asking, they have a family member that has acute flaccid transverse myelitis that was diagnosed earlier this year. And they're asking, is it safe to take this vaccine? Dr. Ansari or anyone else on the panel able to answer that question?
Yes, Assalamu alaikum. I did actually reply a little bit late just now, saying that honestly, I do not know, Allahu Alam, whether it's going to be safe or not. As you know, we don't have much data, especially in people who already have pre-existing conditions, autoimmune conditions. And from an immunologic perspective, there is always potential of triggering an immune response whenever you are exposed to things that would recruit an acceleration of the immune response, which is what a vaccine does. So there's the potential, but I guess we just have to balance the risks and the benefits that might come with taking the vaccine. I think weigh the individual situation of the patient, of the person. If they feel that they're at risk of catching the COVID and having an adverse outcome, then I think it probably is reasonable. But of course, it's a judgment call on the part of the family and the patient and the physicians that are taking care of the patient. And finally, don't forget doing istikhara as well.
Great point, inshallah. For our infectious disease panelist, question is there any major difference in the side effect profile between the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines?
No major side effects. I think the lymphadenopathy was more prominent with Moderna, but no major differences.
So they're similar as far as side effects.
Similar side effects.
Okay, great.
And I think one question is from Dr. Siddiqui, Romana Siddiqui's office patient or something. Is that's especially for the ID specialist. Is it safe to get the vaccine post-COVID infection if IgG antibodies start to wane? The patient is 4 weeks from a positive PCR and antibody titers are rising. And this is the reinfection. First episode was in March. No antibody response after the first infection. Did you guys get the question, or do you want me to repeat it? So
no, I think I understood the question. The question is, what about the vaccine in somebody who has a rising antibody titer, if I understand that correctly? Is that correct?
Yes, 4 weeks from a positive PCR and antibody titers are rising.
So again, there are no specific recommendations from the advisory committee on immunization practices as to what you do with people. And there are a number of people now who, healthcare workers especially, and others that have had the virus. And so we think that immunity will wane. And, it may be that somebody who has just had the illness and still has detectable antibody is protected with natural immunity. We don't know, because these tests are not actually assessing neutralizing antibody. So we don't know what the protection is. It is reasonable to vaccinate a person at this point or later. So, I don't think there's a contraindication to necessarily vaccinate the person. And I'm not sure that it's necessary to, follow antibody titers in order to do that. The initial sort of tentative recommendations that some have made, and again, experts have disagreed about this, but is 90 days after the infection to consider that, because that is when it may be expected that some people's immunity will wane. There are many that will have an immune response much longer than that, and that has been demonstrated in some people that they have antibodies and even neutralizing antibodies much later. So this is a very individual kind of thing. It's hard to make blanket.
One of my colleagues who's a gastroenterologist in Florida is asking for the ID consultants here, and it'll be interesting for myself to get the take on this, is recommendations in regards to immunomodulators and TNF inhibitors, biologics in patients with inflammatory bowel disease, or be it rheumatoid arthritis. Any recommendation in regarding altering doses? We don't use live vaccines, obviously, when patients are on biologics in the IBD arena, but in regards to the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine, any recommendation in regards to management with immunosuppressants?
for the vaccine prior to vaccination or? for
Yeah,
the-
yeah. I mean, I think if someone has the IBD and they're on infliximab, and is there any recommendation of should we be lowering the dose or maybe doing it at a trough before their dose? Any? I know we're entering that arena of that gray zone where we probably don't have answers and we're going to rely on expert opinion. So any opinion from our ID experts, Dr. Ahmed?
No recommendations, no specific recommendations. They are saying the CDC also recommended that not to change the immunosuppressive medication, or they have not said no alteration. And if there is any contraindication to vaccination, then do not vaccinate, but they are not recommending decreasing the dose of immunosuppression at this time.
May I say something?
Sure.
So the American Society of Transplantation has come out with a recommendation, and every transplant patient is on significant amount of immunosuppression, much more than autoimmune conditions. And the recommendation is to go ahead and take that because these are the people who are most susceptible to serious disease. The response may not be as robust as we would like or would be in people who are not on immunosuppression, but the goal is to immunize them and hope that they mount an antibody response, and most do actually. May not be as robust as a person who's not on immunosuppression, but they do. And there is no risk of a live virus here, so the only downside would be that there might not be a good response, a desired response.
So I think this is one of those things, as you said, for which there are not data. And so it's probably going to be a case-by-case thing. So if you have a patient with inflammatory bowel disease, then you're going to have to look at that patient and see how critical it will be for them and managing their inflammatory disease in terms of how you modify their immunosuppression. So if there's somebody who you could modify it in, it would be better. But obviously you have to balance those risks. So it's going to be very difficult to make blanket statements. But I think as we go forward, probably the transplantation community and others, they will be able to present some data and we'll be able to see. But the biggest risk is going to be, lack of protection. You're just going to have to do that on a case-by-case basis.
That's great. I'm just looking at the questions. Some questions were already answered privately by our panelists as well. I'm just trying to look at some final questions here. How about for a patient who has multiple drug allergies? Any caution in regards to getting the vaccine?
I guess the caution would be, there have been people that have had reactions, right? So I mentioned those two patients in the UK. But these were patients that had had severe allergies with vaccine before. These were people carrying EpiPen. So if you have had a problem with the vaccine before, then you should be careful. But in terms of antibiotic allergies or drug allergies, generally they shouldn't cross over. You have to look at the ingredient list, which has been published by both the companies. And as I said before, they're pretty clean vaccines. There's not a lot of ingredients in these.
I think another simple question, it's simple to some. Why does this virus affect older people more than younger people? And why do some people recover without displaying any symptoms? I think it's for ID as well as immunology. Like why is it doing that? And is this normal?
I think people need to know that immunology, knowledge of immunology exposes that how much we don't know. What is happening in all the field, whether it's a cancer, autoimmunity, many a time we are learning from the immune system to tell us how normally, naturally our body fights all these insults and diseases. So there are very little known. There are mostly unknown questions that we cannot answer ahead of time. And all we have to do is we have to read and find out, do literature survey. And then I would think, and just for those people who are not the ID specialist or those people who are not experts in their field, that our conversation is just for giving you a very curbside advice. You need to be talking to your own physicians. You need to be talking to your own specialists, and they themselves are not going to cook it at home. We are all professional. We are bound by our respective societies and their regulations, and there are rules. and they keep on changing. So we need to follow the updated rules. So I think for the general public, advice is please seek help from a expert, your professional, and don't go by the WhatsApp knowledge or Google knowledge. They are not the experts. Please, I'm not advertising for that, but I think that's what I think, that we need to be asking the right people the right question and then follow, because your health is at stake.
Alhamdulillah, I think we covered, Dr. Shakib, anything that we missed? I think we got all the questions.
Yeah, I think if you get the vaccine, can you test positive during routine PCR testing?
Yeah, so no, that would not be expected, right? So we are not giving you a live virus. So the hope is that you would test positive for antibody, right, when you get an immune response, but you're not going to get a false positive PCR because you received the vaccine.
Okay, I think I'm all good here, Dr. Fazil.
So I think Jazakallah khair for everyone today. Please don't hang up. Don't hang up. Sheikh Amin, can I kindly request you to make a dua for everyone on this call, our ummah, and in these challenging times.
Jazakumullah khair. Thank you very much for thinking of me and inviting me here. It's a great honor and blessing. Hopefully Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts all our services for the ummah and for mankind in general. As I said, this is a demonstration of how well we are, mashallah, in the USA, that we are fortunate to have so many experts on this one issue, and imagine all the experts in the other fields too, that we could create a whole, mashallah, ummah here in the USA one day. So we make dua. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار اللهم اشف مرضانا وارحم موتانا اشف مرضانا وارحم موتانا اللهم اشف مرضانا وارحم موتانا. Oh Allah, protect us from this COVID. Allah, protect us from this COVID virus. Allah, protect us from all diseases, from all illnesses, from all maladies, and from all operations. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give us health and give us wealth. Allah, give us afiyah and give us comfort in this world and the world hereafter. Allah, protect us from committing sin, protect us from harm, protect us from any harm that is physical, any harm that is mental or psychological, any harm that is intellectual, any harm that is spiritual. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep us and preserve us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep us and keep our parents and keep our children and keep our family members. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam from calamities and disasters. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect all of mankind from calamities and disasters. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us all onto the path of the deen and the path of the truth. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept us and raise us on the day of judgment, such that he is pleased with us and we are pleased with him. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen. Wa sallallahu ta'ala ala khayri khalqi Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Bi rahmatika ya arhamar rahimin. Walhamdulillah.
On behalf of Dr. Tajamul Hussain, the founder of CMMA, the CMMA board, Dr. Ismail Shakib, our panelists, we sincerely thank you, to Sheikh Amin as well, and all the attendees. I hope this was a benefit to everyone. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.